Welcome back to the How to Japanese podcast. This is season 3, the Haruki Murakami season, and this is episode 5, the first in a series of 3 episodes about Murakami's complete bibliography. Today I'll be going through the years 1979 to 1987, so an 8-year period. This is an activity that was inspired by a man named Osakabe Yoshio. Osakabe-san has run a fan website dedicated to Murakami for the past 20 plus years, and maybe even longer than that, to be honest. I discovered his website while I was in college, while I was writing my senior thesis, and used it to track down obscure magazine articles. He has a list of all of Murakami's publications. I don't think it's 100% complete, but it's one of the most complete that I've seen out there, and it's been online for the longest, I would say. For more information about him, you can check out an interview with him done by my classmate from IUC, Tu Huang Ha, a writer at the Japan Times. I'll put a link to that in the blog post, and I'll also link to Osakabe-san's website. Inspired by him earlier this year, as I kind of started preparing for this podcast and also rereading all of Murakami's novels, I started to put together a Google document version of Murakami's bibliography. Right now, I only have his books, all his novels, nonfiction books, translations, and any kind of book form writing I have in a Google document. And you can read along with that during the podcast. You can find that at bit.ly/Murakami bibliography. I don't know if you need to put the M and the B capitalized in those, but if so, the M in Murakami and the B in bibliography should be capitalized. And once more, that's bit.ly/Murakami bibliography. Go and check that out, and you can follow along. This is a work in progress. I will hopefully be updating this as I go forwards, and maybe even adding to it individual publications of articles, because I think it would be really interesting to get even more granular to see how Murakami's writing career went, and that's something we can do. But for now, I just have the books, and that's what I'll be looking at today. I'll be looking at the books, except for this first podcast. I'll be a little bit more granular here, especially in his first couple of years, because I think it speaks to how quickly Murakami plugged into the literary scene in Japan and how prolific he was almost immediately. If you hear any mistakes or have more detailed publication information about these works, please do contact me. I'd love to hear that, and also have the opportunity to make any corrections in future podcasts. You can contact me at howtojapanese@gmail.com. And this really, I think, I don't know who this is for, other than people who are interested in Murakami and perhaps future students of Japanese literature studying Murakami. Maybe this is for you. Murakami is a pretty mainstream subject at this point, and it may seem like there's no new ground to break, but I assure you that's not the case. There really is a tremendous amount that you could research about Japanese publishing, about Japanese magazines, about other smaller figures in the Japanese literary scene, and what that says about writing in Japan and publishing in Japan, and how the last 50 years in Japan have gone. If you feel compelled to read Murakami and to study him, to comb through his works, just keep going, dig deeper, and maybe this is a starting point for you. So with this episode, we're looking at an 8-year period, 1979 to 1987. Murakami writes 5 novels in an 8-year period that turn him from an unknown jazz bar owner into the voice of a generation and someone who can sell 1 million novels. That's insane. That's really crazy. And let's see how he did it. We're going to go year by year, starting in 1979. In 1979, Murakami writes 1 novel. He translates 1 short story, and he writes lots of essays. That novel is, of course, Hear the Wind Sing, Kaze no Uta o Kike, and he publishes that in the June issue of Gunzo. I don't know when he submitted it for the prize or the deadline or about anything like that, but it was published in the June issue of Gunzo, and which means it probably came out in May, if the publication schedule currently is like it applies to how it was back in the 70s. The magazines tend to come out late in the month prior to the month on the title. It comes out in June, so May, June, and then the hardcover version is published on July 25th, 1979. An interesting piece of trivia about his first novel: the original title when he submitted the work for the contest was Happy Birthday and White Christmas. And we know this because the editor at Gunzo at the time, her name was Kinoshita Yoko, and her name currently is Saito Yoko, has a blog post on Kodansha's website. It's just a short post, but it talks about her. She was in charge of the publication of the hardcover of the book. She notes that she thought it was a shame that the title changed. I would beg to differ. The catchline "Happy Birthday and White Christmas" is a line the rat uses to sign off all his letters to the narrator whose birthday is on Christmas Eve. She says at one point she had trouble kind of making conversation with Murakami, who's a bit quiet. And so she asked him, "Were you born on Christmas Eve?" assuming maybe that he was writing from his own experience. And he says, "No, I was born on January 12th, which shocked her because that was her birthday. So that was a funny little anecdote. But she does not mention who made the title change, whether it was Murakami himself or someone at Kodansha. We also have her to thank for the great cover by Sasaki Maki, who is a figure I'll probably be talking about a lot, a very well-known illustrator, children's book author, manga artist. And she went to Kyoto to visit him on behalf of Murakami. And so that was their initial connection. We'll hear this Kinoshita Yoko, or Saito Yoko, come up again because Murakami mentions her by name in one of his works in 1990, one of his pieces of travel writing. She ends up being involved with the publication of Norwegian Wood as well. So we see from the very early days of Murakami, he's creating these relationships in the publishing industry that then connect him with other parts of his career. So here the Wensing details Murakami's Boku narrator visiting his hometown in Kansai during the summer break of his third year at college. He drinks beer, he smokes cigarettes with his friend the rat, he shines his father's shoes, he tries to track down a high school classmate who dedicates a song on the radio to him, and he goes on dates with the girl with four fingers whom he took care of after she drank too much at Jay's bar. And then he returns to Tokyo. It's classic early Murakami in that not much happens, yet he's hinting at broad swaths of Japanese history in a very understated way. Some key things to note about this novel: it's narrated from 1978 about 1970. It's about grieving and loss, the narrator still coming to terms with losing his girlfriend, and also I think with the dissolution of the student movement after 1970. And you hear this from Murakami himself, in an interview that he did with Murakami Ryu, the other novelist, the writer of Coin Locker Babies. He said, back then all sorts of people were agitated, right? Even the novelists were pretty agitated. If you asked them at the time, they were really comfortable with that. But when the era ended, there was nothing left. Right around 1970, I had this intense feeling that words had no meaning. And so that's where Murakami's writing from. Yeah, as I mentioned in the power rankings, surrogacy, the characters here are all trying to replace a feeling. Both versions of the narrator here, both the narrator in the novel acting in the past and the narrator narrating it, seem to be kind of chasing something. And same with the girl with four fingers and the rat. It was a letdown, I think, after 1970 for a lot of people. So Murakami starts publishing short stories almost immediately after this in the spring of 1980 and into 1981 and 1982, while almost simultaneously working on his next novel and doing translations. In fact, he published a translation of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Lo the Poor Peacock in August of 1979, so just a month after his book goes into hardcover. It's published in Kaie magazine, and it also includes an essay by Murakami. There's not much information about Kaie magazine. It's potentially named after the French explorer Auguste Rene Caillé, the first European to return alive from Timbuktu. So it's pretty impressive for Murakami to set his sights on F. Scott Fitzgerald so early in his career. And actually, he notes this in his book, The Translation Works of Haruki Murakami. The Japanese title is Murakami Haruki Honyaku Hotondo Zen Shigoto. This is a book I'll be referencing quite a bit. It's a book that has a few essays by Murakami about translation. It's got a conversation between him and Shibata Motoyuki, a very famous translator, about translation. And then it has an illustrated section about all the translation works he's done. So it has pictures of the books that he's translated with a few paragraphs of commentary by him. And he says in this book that thinking about translating Fitzgerald so early makes him break out in a cold sweat. So I think he recognizes what a task he was taking on back then. I think we also have to recognize that this was the 1970s still, and F. Scott Fitzgerald was still in the process of being kind of rehabilitated in the literary scene, or being recognized. His full greatness was still being kind of recognized. And Lo the Poor Peacock actually was published in the U.S. in Esquire in 1971. It had been previously unpublished. So maybe that's why Murakami first had it in mind as something to translate. So that's 1979. He's got the one novel and the one translated short story, and then he's writing a lot of other essays. I think, the essay about Fitzgerald is similar. He's also writing essays about movies and other stuff. He's very active immediately. In 1980, he writes one novel, one novella. He does more Fitzgerald translation, and he's starting to put out short stories, fiction short stories, that I won't mention by name because they don't get collected until the later years, but he's being very active. And speaking of being active, it all seems to be happening at once. In February of 1980, Murakami publishes his second Fitzgerald short story, 3 Hours Between Planes. It's published in the magazine Happy End Tsushin, which I don't know too much more about, but I know that it's a magazine on American culture that he ends up contributing to pretty regularly early in his career. And then a month later, he publishes Pinball 1973 in March of 1980. Again, this is in Gunzo magazine. So within, it's not even a year. So Hear the Wind Sing is in the June issue of Gunzo. And then less than a year later, he has his second novel, Pinball 1973, also in Gunzo. And they both are candidates for the Akutagawa Prize, as I mentioned in the last podcast episode. And in between those two, he publishes 2 Fitzgerald short stories. Kind of an impressive start to a career. Although at the same time, not fully recognized by the pure literature establishment. Not being awarded the Akutagawa Prize, so it's still kind of distant from the pure literature establishment. So Pinball 1973 goes into hardcover in June 20th of 1980. And it's set in 1973. Boku is now 24 and working as a translator at a small company set up with a friend. They have a secretary who works for them. He has twins living with him, but he seems to be suffering from extreme grief for the loss of Naoko, a woman who lived in a small town. We don't learn much more about her other than that. Over the course of the novel, he becomes obsessed with pinball and, in particular, a 3-flipper spaceship model. And he eventually tracks it down in an empty refrigerated warehouse, and has a moment to kind of say goodbye to both it and kind of through it to, I think, Naoko, which is implied. At the same time, the rat is stuck in the Kansai hometown they're both from. He's super depressed and obsessed with the kind of inexorable passage of time. And he's been seeing a woman there, but he resolved to leave town. The key points, I think, with pinball are this unzari, this sense of frustration, boredom, of being kind of fed up with everything. And then the other key point I would say is surrogacy. Again, trying to scratch an itch that can't be scratched by traveling to Naoko's hometown to see this train station with a dog she always talked about, by trying to find this pinball machine and recreate that obsession that he had briefly with playing pinball. Murakami didn't like these novels in the middle of his career. And even as recently as 2017, in the book about his translations, he mentions that he wasn't convinced they were very good, even at the time of publication, that he wanted to write a different kind of novel. Murakami then goes on to do another 4 F. Scott Fitzgerald short stories in 1980. In August of 1980, he publishes My Lost City in Happy End Tsushin. And then in the December issue of Umi, published by Chuo Koronsha, a pretty well-known magazine, he publishes 3 translations of Fitzgerald: The Lees of Happiness, The Ice Palace, and An Alcoholic Case. That seems a little bit crazy to me, but this is a magazine he also has a connection with. Earlier in 1980, in April 1980, this is the magazine that published his first short story, A Slow Boat to China. That will get collected in a collection with that same title in a couple years. But I wanted to mention it here because I think it shows Murakami making connections, publishing impressive amounts of fiction and translation almost immediately. In September of 1980, he publishes his novella, The Town and Its Uncertain Wall, Machi to Sono Futashika na Kabe, or if we're going by the new title, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. This is published in the September issue of Bungakukai. I already went into depth about this novella in the first 2 episodes of this series, so I won't mention too much more about it here, other than to say that he was up for the Akutagawa Prize, and someone kind of got in his ear and suggested he should have something ready for publication in case that he won, and that he immediately regretted publishing it. That he felt that he kind of knew that he didn't have the chops to carry out this experimental style that he was doing, but he also recognizes that it was a critical step toward Hardboiled Wonderland, and that had he not written it, then that novel would have been very different from what it ended up being. So that's 1980. Moving on to 1981, Murakami publishes 1 book of translation, 1 short fiction collection, and then I'll mention 1 other kind of nonfiction work. The translation comes first. In May 20th of 1981, Murakami publishes My Lost City by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's an original selection by Murakami of Fitzgerald's stories. It's not based on a collection, and I think it includes most of the stories he had already done to that point. On July 20th of 1981, he publishes Walk, Don't Run. This is what is called a taidan. Taidan is, there's no direct translation for it, but it's a very Japanese phenomenon. It's basically a conversation between 2 people, often writers. So this one was with Murakami Ryu, and it collects 2 taidan, 2 conversations that they had. I quoted from it earlier during that conversation about 1970 and how everyone was kind of agitated at the time. That was part of the conversation that he had with Murakami Ryu. On November 25th, 1981, Murakami publishes his first collected short fiction. It's a book with the title Let's Meet in a Dream. It's actually a collaboration with Itoi Shigesato, who is a famous copywriter and the brain and the writer behind the Mother/Earthbound games, really well known. Murakami created a list of foreign-derived words. They divvied them up, and each of them wrote short fiction inspired by the words that they had. There are 98 stories that are organized in order of the Japanese syllabary. The cover price was 980 yen, and so the cover notes that each story was just 10 yen. So you're really getting your value's worth with this book. There's a website called Yomuka, which has a pretty good description of Let's Meet in a Dream. You know, it's got a full list of the words. You know, the words are things like elevator, Shangri-La, lark, radio, hotel, highway. Both their names are included, Haruki Murakami and Shigesato Itoi. And they have a translation of a part of the opening, or actually it's a preface of the 1986 reprinting. And Murakami explains that it's neither a short story collection nor a book of essays, nor is it a miscellaneous mix of assorted manuscripts. In short, I guess it's a book of enigmas. From its very conception, this book has always harbored mysteries. After all, every single chapter title sprawled across the book is written in katakana. The two of us, Itoi and I, just hammered out these stories or essays or whatever and threw them all together. And now that I think about it, it's incredibly unique, assertive even, a concept that I can't quite make any sense of. It's usually pretty confusing to figure out why we inadvertently write some words in katakana anyway, but to that end, there exists an underground power plant by the name of Nariyuki, which he wrote in katakana, for which this book owes its successful completion and the chance to see the light of day. Nariyuki is just kind of the course of things, and so this is kind of just something that happened and came together, and I think is very Murakami in that way. It shows that he's playful, random, collaborative, and experimental, especially early in his career. This book hasn't been translated, and I doubt that it will until the copyright is up, to be honest. So we'll be waiting a while. So that's 1981. In 2 years, Murakami's written 2 novels and is able to become a full-time writer. Jay Rubin, in his book Haruki Murakami and the Music of Words, writes about Murakami's lifestyle change before A Wild Sheep Chase. Moves out of Tokyo to Funabashi. He stops smoking. He starts running. He's also not running his jazz bar anymore, which it's crazy to even think about how productive he was while running a jazz bar. Just insane. So in 1982, Murakami writes just one novel, being what I think is his best novel. In August of 1982, he publishes A Wild Sheep Chase in Gunzo, Hitsuji o Meguru Bolken in Japanese. And then the hardcover version comes out on October 15th of 1982. So again, his first 3 novels all serialized in literary magazines before they go into hardcover. And with A Wild Sheep Chase, we've caught up to the present of Murakami's now 29-year-old Boku narrator. It's no longer retrospective. He's narrating kind of as the action's happening. It's 1978. He's recently divorced from his wife. He's working with his partner, who's an alcoholic with 2 kids. And he's sleeping with a 21-year-old part-time ear model, proofreader, high-class call girl. The rat is still lost, hasn't recovered, and is wandering from town to town, taking work. When he asks Boku to publish a photograph of a sheep, it draws the attention of some ultra-right-wing politicians and forces Boku and his girlfriend to go exploring in Hokkaido to find the sheep. So some key points. This is kind of a staggering evolution in narrative ability, I think. The story is far more focused. The camera lingers on scenes longer. He has more control over how those scenes are working. The tone is very different. It starts sad. Shifts to the present where Boku is very funny and cynical. In the last episode, I said that this was Murakami at the peak of his powers, which might have been kind of overstating the case a bit, but maybe it was kind of the perfect balance between having had a couple books under his belt, a lot more writing, and yet still kind of not tearing off more than he could chew, kind of being scared enough as a young writer to not try and do too much. So staying within this kind of hardboiled detective novel style combined with Murakami's look at the student movement and immediate post-student movement in Japan. And that's it for 1982. But I think, as we'll see in 1983, that he was quietly at work on all these short stories that eventually get published in a collected edition in 1983. In 1983, he publishes 2 collections of short stories, 1 translation and 1 book of nonfiction. This is really Murakami's year of short fiction, I think. On May 20th, 1983, he publishes A Slow Boat to China, his first collection. It has 7 stories in it. A Slow Boat to China, A Poor Ant Story, The New York Mining Disaster, Kangaroo Communique, The Last Lawn of the Afternoon, Her Little Dog in the Ground, and Sydney Greenstreet. And those are published between April 1980 and December 1982 pretty regularly in all different sorts of magazines. Umi, Shincho, Brutus, Takarajima, Subaru, and then another a version of Umi. And there's some real classics. 4 of these get included in his first English collection, The Elephant Vanishes. And then one of the stories that hasn't been translated, Sydney Greenstreet, is worth mentioning just because it features the sheep man from A Wild Sheep Chase. It's really a pretty poorly written story, to be honest. I think technically and content wise, it's not very successful, but it's interesting. It's about the narrator's working as a private detective on Green Street in Sydney, and he only takes interesting cases. And the sheep man comes in looking for help finding his stolen right ear, which was taken by the sheep professor. This was published in December of 1982, so several months after A Wild Sheep Chase. So it seems like Murakami is getting meta a little early in his career. I think another way to think about it is Murakami often writes and publishes like a musician. He's doing a new riff on old material, or is giving you a special edition with extra tracks or something like that. I think that's one way to think about Murakami's content. So after publishing his first real collection of short stories, the Let's Meet in a Dream was kind of shorts and experimental. A Slow Boat to China being his first collection, a real collection of short stories. He publishes, like 2 months later, on July 15th, 1983, a translation of Raymond Carver's Where I'm Calling From. This is a follow-up to the work he did for the magazine Umi. They asked him if there was anything else he wanted to do, and Murakami suggested Carver. He read the story So Much Water, So Close to Home in an anthology and was really impressed. Murakami picked out stories he thought he would do well, that would do well in Japan. So this is, again, I think, an original anthology selected by Murakami. And Murakami notes that it was refreshing to go from translating someone like Fitzgerald to a contemporary writer who was still publishing. And one other thing to note about this collection is that this connection with Umi seems to have been really important. In the May 1983 issue, he publishes 7 Raymond Carver stories and an essay on Carver. And those stories are Why Don't You Dance, Tell the Women We're Going, Cathedral, Sax, Are You a Doctor, Where I'm Calling From, So Much Water, So Close to Home. They're all in the same issue, and it comes out the same month that A Slow Boat to China comes out. So again, an impressive amount of material very early in his career. 2 months after that, he publishes on September 9th, 1983, Kangaroo Biori, which I guess we could translate as A Lovely Day for Kangaroos. This is a collection of 23 short stories, shorter than the ones in A Slow Boat to China, but longer than the ones in Let's Meet in a Dream. These were published every month for over 2 years in a magazine called Trèfle, which is truffle. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's a French word that means clover. It's a small magazine that Murakami says hardly anyone ever read. So it's published from April 1981 to March 1983. Every month, while he was doing his other writing, he had a short story in this magazine that was published by the Isetan department store and sent to members of the Shusai no Sakuru, is how he describes it, which is sponsors of some kind. So I guess either members or advertisers or something like that. And Japanese Wikipedia actually mentions that there's supplementary commentary from his complete works that the editor from Happy and Tsushin moved to Truffle and asked Murakami to write. So this is pretty representative, I think, of both Murakami's experience as a writer and the Japanese publishing industry. There's lots of churn. Editors are working with writers they're familiar with, and when they move to other publications, they're bringing them along with them, seeing if they could publish something for them, especially if they're reliable. So during these 2 years that Murakami's writing for this magazine, he's also putting out the stories in Let's Meet in a Dream. He also puts out A Wild Sheep Chase and all the other short stories he collected in A Slow Boat to China. So of the stories in this collection, several have been translated. Ones that would be familiar are On Meeting the 100% Perfect Girl, the 1963-1982 Girl from Ipanema, Dab Chick, The Mirror, The Year of Spaghetti, The Rise and Fall of Sharpie Cakes. There's a story that's in this collection called Do You Like Burt Bacharach that was retitled to A Window. and published in Elephant Vanishes. I think the key things to note about this collection is that it really gives him an opportunity to experiment. The audience for this is much smaller. These are really playful stories. They're very short. He's really doing he's playing with a lot of different styles of narration too. So he's getting a lot of different kinds of repetitions. The book is illustrated by Sasaki Maki. He's the illustrator that did also the covers for his first three novels. So Pinball, Hear the Wind Sing, and A Wild Sheep Chase. A Slow Boat to China's cover was done by Anzai Mizumaru, who's the other illustrator who works really closely with Murakami on a lot of different works, and you'll start to hear his name pretty frequently. So Murakami had been a fan of Sasaki since he was publishing in Garo, which is a monthly magazine that was kind of avant-garde and alternative. It was left-wing and affiliated with Zengakuren, which is associated with the student movement. In a book called The Elephant Factory's Happy End, which will come up a little bit later, Murakami has a tie-down conversation with Anzai Mizumaru where he mentions that he basically forced Sasaki to do the cover of his first novel, which was an unusual choice because Sasaki was basically doing manga and children's books at the time. Another thing to note is that the Sheepman makes another appearance here in a set of stories called Toshokan Kitan, which is, I guess, translated as something like the mysterious stories from the library. It's published, very almost simultaneously with A Wild Sheep Chase. These stories are published from June to November of 1982, which is right when The Wild Sheep Chase comes out. So again, this is Murakami riffing almost like a musician or being meta with his characters. One last thing I'd say about this collection is that it's a really nice looking collection. If you're a Murakami fan living in Japan, or if you have a friend who's a big Murakami fan, this would make an excellent gift for them or for you. First editions are really not that difficult to find right now, and they just make a really beautiful piece of literature. So if you're looking for something fun to have, or if you're looking just to get started reading Murakami, this is a great place to do it. And the last work from 1983 was published on December 5th, 1983. It's called The Elephant Factory's Happy End, Zou Kojo no Happy Endo. And it is kind of unclassifiable. I said it was nonfiction, but it's one of these short works that Murakami does that's somewhere in the middle. It's a book of playful kind of short shorts illustrated by Anzai Mizumaru. I mentioned him briefly just above in relation to this little collection. It was kind of a happy coincidence. Anzai was asked to do a collection of his drawings, and Murakami was asked to do an essay collection, and both were kind of hesitant to do one on their own at that point, and so they ended up doing this together. Some of these were previously published in Brutus, Today, and Happy End Tsushin magazines between 1980 and 1982. It's really heavy on the illustrations. The stories include an ad for Cuddy Sark whiskey, a short about getting a record player with a Bing Crosby record for Christmas, and one about a talking dog. This is one of Murakami's first collaborations with Anzai. And the first of these was the short included here called Twilight in the Mirror, published in the July 1981 issue of Today. As I mentioned, Anzai did the cover for Slow Boat to China, and the illustrations in this collection are very similar. They're kind of this Kirie style that are a lot of still lifes. He's got illustrations of like English magazines, American magazines, little items on the desk. He's got references to Matisse. These two were extremely productive together. This is the first of many collaborations that we'll see. And the one last piece of trivia related to Anzai Mizumaru that's worth noting here is that his real name is Watanabe Noboru, which is a name that should be familiar to any readers of some of Murakami's fiction, but it might also sound very similar to a name from the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, Wataya Noboru. And that's because he played a lot with this name, Watanabe Noboru, used it for characters. And then when he wrote the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, because that character ended up being kind of the villain, he changed it. I think he felt bad that he didn't want Anzai Mizumaru's real name to be kind of associated with that character. On to 1984. In 1984, Murakami publishes one short story collection and one nonfiction book. The short story collection is Firefly, Barn Burning, and Other Stories, which is published on July 1st, 1984. And it includes 5 stories. Those are Firefly, Barn Burning, The Dancing Dwarf, Blind Willow, Sleeping Woman, and 3 German fantasies. And those are all published in Chuo Koron, Shincho, Bungakukai, and Brutus. So again, these are mainstream Japanese publications, magazines, and literary journals. It's another extremely solid set of stories. 4 of them have been translated. Barn Burning was adapted into the 2018 Korean movie called Burning, which is an extremely intense take on that story, but I think worth a watch. They're basically realistic works with the dancing dwarf thrown in. I think the most important story here is Firefly, which is the seed for Norwegian Wood and tells the story of a narrator living in a college dorm in Tokyo. He runs into a girl who dated his best friend in high school who committed suicide. It's basically Naoko from Norwegian Wood, and it tells the first part of that story, the point up to which Naoko basically leaves Tokyo and then writes a letter to the narrator. The 3 German fantasies is also an interesting story because it hasn't been translated, I don't think, but it was published in Brutus in an issue that Murakami basically took over. He went to Germany for a month and then published a series of short essays for the issue called Deutschland Now, which was a special issue on Germany. So again, Murakami's not only doing his own writing, he's doing this kind of magazine type work, travel writing, lots of different types of different writing alongside this kind of literary writing that he's doing. I'm realizing I didn't give much context to Brutus here. Brutus is a lifestyle magazine, kind of a lifestyle/men's magazine that usually has a single topic for each issue. So it'll have an issue on like denim, or an issue on Murakami, for example, is one of the recent ones they had. So I think it's notable that he basically takes over this issue relatively early in his career. The cover for this collection is also by Anzai Mizumaru, who is kind of starting to become his short story collection cover artist, with the exception of Kangaroo Biori. The cover here is different, though. It has written words on it, and it's not Anzai Mizumaru's normal drawings, and that was a request from Murakami. 2 weeks later, on July 15th, 1984, Murakami publishes Murakami Asahido. Jay Rubin has translated the title of this as Murakami's House of the Rising Sun in his book, Haruki Murakami and the Music of Words. It's a set of short essays that were published in a newspaper called Arubaito News, I think newspaper magazine, which literally means part-time work news. It's published over a year and 9 months and includes around 80 short essays, which I think means that they were likely published weekly from August 16th, 1982 to May 21st, 1984. Each one is only 2 or so pages, and they're on lots of different topics. Part-time jobs that Murakami's had. He writes on the Yakult Swallows baseball team that he's a big fan of. He writes on writing. He writes about moving house. Murakami says he loves to pack and move. He writes about Valentine's Day, birthday, beers, tofu. It's really his first miscellaneous writing. Zatsubun is what they say in Japanese. It shows that Murakami's almost always in a constant state of productivity. He's always putting out some kind of writing. It's almost a release valve for his thoughts. If he's not writing long fiction, he's writing short fiction. If he's not writing short fiction, he's writing some kind of essays. And I think it would be really interesting to track each of these down individually and put them into a more granular, complete works to see exactly how much writing is coming out and at what pace. But I'll try and get through this first project first. Asahido becomes a label for this type of miscellaneous writing, and Murakami does this kind of collection numerous times over his career, as you'll start to see. And now we're moving into 1985, which I like to call the year of Murakami because he is really extremely productive and he's putting out some of his best material. He publishes one novel, two collections of short stories, two translations, and two books of nonfiction, all in the same year. Um, he's really kind of fine tuning this kind of happy go lucky, cynical view of post student movement, modern Japan. He captures this, I think, in two of his best works with a single metaphor, dead heat on a merry-go-round. This is the idea that we're all just kind of spinning around on a carousel, riding horses, and it looks like we're racing against one another, but when you really can't go anywhere on a carousel, you're fixed in one position, and any kind of competition or trying to get ahead is an illusion that you've created. He develops this idea in short stories he wrote in 1983 and 84, then uses it again in Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World, and then eventually as the title for the set of short stories and in the introduction to those short stories. The title comes from a 1966 crime movie starring James Coburn, which is really bad and only notable for being Harrison Ford's debut film, but it must have struck Murakami because he really runs with it. So Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World is published on June 15th, 1985. It's notable because it's Murakami's first kakioroshi book. Kakioroshi is a book that's published straight into book form and not published in a magazine or serialized beforehand. All his books previously had been published in Gunzo beforehand. It's told in alternating chapters. Watashi is the narrator for one section. The odd chapters is a data agent for the system, and he's used as a tool to test a new data protection technique for an old scientist, and this technique will eventually short-circuit his brain. Boku, the Boku I narrator for the even chapters, is a new resident of a nameless town, which is run by an intimidating gatekeeper and inhabited by flocks of golden unicorn. It's by far Murakami's most ambitious novel to date, and one of the best works that he's written. He developed it from the 1980 novella that we talked about that in previous podcasts and also earlier on this episode. And this book shows Murakami building on his previous themes, right? Like, so he's rewriting a story into something longer. He's riffing again. He is also building on this metaphor, dead heat on a merry-go-round, which isn't immediately apparent, but I think you'll see shortly where that's coming from. It comes up in the Watashi sections toward the end of the novel when he's starting to realize that there's nothing that he could have done to change his fate, really. So I'll include a link to my analysis of that section of the novel in the blog post. So take a look there. I won't say too much more about this novel because I did a really close blogging of it over 6 years, and I compared the novel with the Japanese novel with the English translation, and I also spoke about it on a podcast, Translation Chat with Jen O'Donnell. I'll link to both of those in the blog post. 2 weeks after Hardboiled Wonderland, he publishes a translation of At Night the Salmon Move. This is Raymond Carver. It's an original selection, again, from Murakami of 5 short stories, essays, and 3 poems. This is Murakami's first time translating poetry. And one notable thing about that is Murakami got to meet Carver, I think, in 1983. And he said, "Oh, your poetry has a lot of elements of fiction in it." And that really pleased Carver, supposedly. On September 30th, 1985, Murakami publishes a translation of The Wreck of the Zephyr by Chris Van Allsburg, who you may not recognize immediately unless you've read The Polar Express or Jumanji. He's the artist and author behind those books. Murakami was asked to translate a children's book and had previously been a fan of Van Allsburg, who was also born coincidentally in 1949. So 1985 was the year that the Polar Express won the Caldecott, so there must have been a boom after that. But The Wreck of the Zephyr was published in 1983, so it was just a couple years before that. And Murakami has gone on to do a ton of children's book and illustrated book translations. and a lot of Van Allsburg, almost I think his complete set, to be honest. And Murakami's even done some of his own kind of children's book writing. So we'll keep an eye on that as we go forward. On October 15th, 1985, so again, just 2 weeks later, he publishes a short story collection titled Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round. This is a really interesting collection that I studied for my senior thesis in college, and I'll post a link to that I ended up rewriting that and publishing it on the web journal Neo-Japanism. And it's a really interesting set of stories. It was initially published in a small magazine called In Pocket from the inaugural issue in October 1983 to December 1984 under the title Machi no Nagame. Again, this is something I mentioned in one of the very first podcasts of this season, but he the editor of Gunzo, when Hear the Wind Sing won, which I don't know if it's that woman that I mentioned earlier or someone different, but that editor was the editor of In Pocket and asked him to put together a series of short stories. And so, again, Murakami is participating in the literary scene, and maybe this is something he doesn't want to do completely, but feels like he needs to. So he writes this set of short stories. As I think we'll see, he's starting to get a little bit exhausted with the literary scene, and will eventually try and escape it. But so this title Machi no Nagame is Views of the City. So these are all stories kind of set in cities. They're supposedly true stories related to Murakami, who then is passing them on to the reader. And they kind of tell the story of people stuck in situations they can't escape, people kind of controlled by their compulsions. And these stories are rebranded for the collected edition with an introduction, which introduces this conceit. The idea that these are true stories isn't really introduced as fully in the serialized version, but Murakami takes a long introduction to the collection. It's the first time he's written an introduction to a set of short fiction, and he calls that introduction Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round. And this is where he describes the metaphor for his fiction. He says, I started this kind of series of writing, let's call them sketches for now, as warm-ups for beginning a novel. It struck me that taking notes of facts and nothing but the facts might later become a useful exercise. So at first I had absolutely no intention of publishing these sketches. They were slated to follow the same fate as countless other fragmentary pieces of writing written on a whim scattered inside the desk in my den. However, as I wrote through 3 or 4 of them, I came to feel as though each one of these accounts had some common trait. They all wanted to be told. And that to me was a strange experience. The more we listen to other people's stories, the more we catch glimpses of people's lives through those stories, the more we are seized by a feeling of powerlessness. Sediment is exactly that feeling of powerlessness. The essence of this feeling of powerlessness is that we can't go anywhere. We have a system of movement called our life that can contain ourselves, but at the same time, the system defines us. This closely resembles a merry-go-round. That is to say, we're just rotating around a fixed position at a fixed speed. We aren't going anywhere. We can't get off or change horses. We don't pass anyone and no one passes us. But even so, it appears that we are on this merry-go-round facing a hypothetical enemy intertwined in a fierce dead heat. It may be because of this that facts appear strange or unnatural in some cases. The overwhelming majority of that inner power we call will is lost as soon as it comes into being, but we are unable to realize this, and the resulting vacuum gives rise to strange and unnatural contortions in various phases of our life. At least that's how I feel. Those are 2 little quotes from that introduction that aren't consecutive. There's a space between them, but it's Murakami trying to summarize his worldview or the way he thinks that humans work, to be honest. And these stories, not all of them have been translated. Ones that you'd recognize would be Lederhosen, Nausea 1979, and Hunting Knife, I believe, are translated. But there's also the Man in a Taxi, Poolside, For the Late Queen, Shelter from the Rain, and Baseball Field. I would be surprised if some of those don't come into English eventually. There's one actually in the serialized set that was not included in the final collection. observations on the pure meaning of consumption in the form of a BMW window. This is a set of stories that Murakami keeps coming back to. So in his complete works that's published in 1990, 1991, he admits that these are all fake stories that he made up, that they're not true stories actually. But then he adds an additional story to that set that basically uses that same style. So he likes this method of storytelling, which jumps from this kind of conversation with another person. You're in dialogue with another person, so you're able to use dialogue. And at the same time, you're able to narrate in third person someone else's experience. And so he says in the complete works that it was really important practice for Norwegian Wood and a realistic style of writing. So really interesting collection. Highly recommend picking it up if you're looking for something interesting to read in Japanese. And I think a turning point in Murakami's fiction in terms of what he's able to do, really important work on the road to Norwegian Wood. On November 25th, 1985, he publishes The Sheepman's Christmas, which is short illustrated fiction based on the sheepman from A Wild Sheep Chase. It involves donuts and the twins from Pinball 1973, both Murakami obsessions. There's illustrations by Sasaki Maki, again, his cover artist and collaborator on A Lovely Day for Kangaroos, Kangaroo Biori. And there's an introductory text by both Murakami and Sasaki. This is, again, I think just Murakami kind of having fun, to be honest. And this has been, I think, translated into German because there was a professor who was obsessed with it. Jay Rubin writes about that. But this has not gone into English. And then Murakami finishes up 1985 with 2 books of nonfiction. The first on December 1st, 1985, which I don't know too much about, but it's Jon Abing no Sekai, which I assume would be translated as The World According to John Irving, kind of playing on his, The World According to Garp title. I don't know what the content here. It seems like a collection of essays that has gone out of print. He's likely working on a translation of John Irving at this point, as we'll see next year. That translation would be published. But again, I don't know too much about that. And then at the very end of the year, on December 24th, 1985, there's a wild movie chase. Eiga o Meguru Boken, this book playing on the title of his Wild Sheep Chase novel. It's co-written with Kawamoto Saburo, who's one of the earliest writers to kind of recognize Murakami and the first to interview him in a 1979 issue of that magazine Kaie, where Murakami published his Fitzgerald translation. The book has over 200 essays on movies from the 1940s to the 1980s and covers everything from The Maltese Falcon to Amadeus. They divided them up and wrote them. They were not serialized. I don't know too much about it other than that. Kawamoto Saburo was controversial as a journalist. He was linked with student radicals who ended up killing Japan's self-defense force officer. And that's really all I know of him. I know that, again, he interviewed him for the August 1979 issue of that magazine Kaie, but then he became critical of him later on and was heavily criticized Kafka on the Shore. So again, this shows Murakami being collaborative and interactive in the literary world. So now it's 1986. Murakami is effectively starting to get exhausted from writing fiction, nonfiction, and all this translation that he's done. And I think it's understandable if you think about everything he's put out so far. He also sees himself turning 40 on the horizon. Turning 30 had motivated him to write in the first place, as we learned in the second episode of this series. And he also has this sudden desire to go on a long trip. So in September, they moved to Europe for a number of different reasons, but one of them is, I think, to escape the obligations of the writing world. So just so that he can focus on his own writing, he's not really having to do much other than that. Murakami's often characterized kind of as a recluse, as a non-participant, but I think we've shown that he's collaborative. He's doing a lot of different writing with lots of different people, and he participated in at least 24 different taidan, these kind of conversations that are recorded and transcribed for articles in magazines between 1980 and 1989. That's nearly 3 a year in addition to all his other commitments. And so 1986 in the fall they moved to Europe, and in 1986 he publishes 1 short story collection, 1 translation, and 2 collections of nonfiction. On April 10th, 1986, he publishes The Second Bakery Attack. And this is a set of 6 stories. The Second Bakery Attack, The Elephant Vanishes, A Family Affair, The Twins in the Sunken Continent, The Fall of the Roman Empire, the 1881 Indian Uprising, Hitler's Invasion of Poland and the Realm of the Raging Winds, and finally, The Wind-Up Bird and Tuesday's Women. These are published between 1985 and 1986, and they're really going into a wide range of journals. One's published in Marie Claire. This is The Second Bakery Attack is published in Marie Claire, Bungakukai, Lee, Gekkan Kadokawa, Shinsho, and 5 of these stories go on to be translated and included in The Elephant Vanishes. And then this last story, The Twins in the Sunken Continent, the only reason that isn't translated, I think, is because it's a sequel to Pinball 1973, effectively. It's the narrator from Murakami's first 3 novels seeing the twins in a photograph taken in a nightclub and being kind of shocked. The story takes place between Pinball and A Wild Sheep Chase, but it's published in 86 after Sheep Chase, but before Dance, Dance, Dance. So again, this is Murakami riffing, I think, on his own ideas like a musician might. I think it's actually a pretty good story, and I wrote about it in my review of 1Q84. So I'll make sure to share that link in the blog post. But other than that, this is just, again, Murakami hard at work on really solid fiction, doing a wide range of stuff, really kind of narrowing in, I think, in this collection, specifically on that realism that has very slight elements of heightened reality with things like The Elephant Vanishes and The Second Bakery Attack in particular. And I can't forget The Wind-Up Bird and Tuesday's Women. This is 6 years before he'll start writing the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. And he's generating these ideas that he's going to sit on and then continue developing later. On May 23rd, 1986, Murakami's translation of Setting Free the Bears by John Irving is published. Murakami was in Europe while translating this book, so he went to Vienna, where the novel is set, and spent time at the zoo there. He also went to the U.S. to speak with John Irving. Jay Rubin's written a lot about this in his book. But in Murakami's book on his translation, he says that the only thing he remembers about meeting him that day is they went on a jog in Central Park and that Irving yelled, "Horse shit, horse shit." And that's the only thing he can remember now. Murakami doesn't remember whether this is because there was actual horse shit that I guess somebody stepped in or something, and which you can imagine in Central Park, or because of something Murakami said in the interview. But I thought that was a pretty funny story, so I thought I'd share that here. On June 25th, 1986, Murakami publishes Revenge of the Murakami Asahido, so Revenge of Murakami's House of the Rising Sun, which is another set of serialized essays. They're serialized this time in a different magazine, in Shukan Asahi, from April 5th, 1985 to April 4th, 1986, so almost exactly a year. Illustrated again by Anzai Mizumaru. These essays are getting slightly longer, so they're not like the 2-page essays in the first Asahido. These are like 3 to 5 page essays, and again, really varied topics. He talks about Kansai Ben, the Kansai dialect, movie theaters, the death of a cat, what does middle age mean, and again, the Yakult swallows. And then he ends the year on November 30th, 1986, with another short little illustrated book of writing called Afternoons on the Islets of Langerhans. Langerhans to no gogo. Islets of Langerhans are also called the pancreatic islets. It's some part of the body, and it's taken from a story in the collection that where the narrator, which I think is probably nonfiction writing about from Murakami, where he has to run home to pick up a textbook that he's forgotten. So he runs home, gets the textbook, then he sees this patch of grass, and he just decides to take a nap in the grass or lie down in the grass for a minute. And he has this thought about these pancreatic islets or whatever that they must have been talking about during biology class or something. But at any rate, this is a set of essays published between June 1984 and May 1986 in the magazine Classy, which I don't know too much about. They're illustrated by Anzai Mizumaru. Really beautiful little collection. One little interesting note is that one of the illustrations here these include the very typical Anzai Mizumaru kind of still lifes with little items like peanuts on the table or a book or a baseball and matches. And in one of the illustrations, it has Murakami's book, Kangaroo Byori, which I thought was really cool. So you get Anzai Mizumaru's illustration of Sasaki Maki's cover art of Murakami's short story collection, A Beautiful Day for Kangaroos. So highly recommend picking up this one. I have a little bunkobon version, and I am going to be keeping my eye on a first edition online at some point, I'm sure. So yeah, these are serialized over 2 years. He adds an additional kakioroshi one for the collected edition, and that's the one that gives it its eventual title. I guess one little item of note is interesting is that in the introduction, Murakami mentions that he usually writes sober, but sometimes when he sees an Anzai Mizumaru drawing, he goes to the kitchen to make a mizuwari, a whiskey and water, and just starts writing because he gets inspired. And he says that when he does this kind of writing, it's filled with Mizumaru-ness, which he compares to sitting at a familiar bar, writing a letter to a friend. And that, I think, does capture nicely in words the sense of Anzai Mizumaru's art. And that's 1986. As I mentioned previously, Murakami moves to Europe at the end of this year, and he's living in Greece and Italy. And in 2011, he wrote an essay that was collected in a 2015 set of travel essays, a collected edition. And he went back to Europe and revisited some of the areas where he had lived. And he has this little quote about this trip that he went on. Nearly 24 years ago now, I was living on Greek islands, Spetsis and Mykonos. Living was only about 3 months total combined, but it was my first time living abroad, and it turned into a very memorable experience. Every day I kept records in my notebook, and afterward I put them all together into the travelogue Toi Taiko, a distant drum. I had the chance to go to Greece a number of times thereafter, but I never visited those islands again, so this was my first return since then. English has the expression pilgrimage. Using that term might be a slight exaggeration, but I followed my steps from a quarter century in the past, so it's safe to say that it was nostalgic. Mykonos especially has a kind of affection within me because it's where I started writing Norwegian wood. I arrived in Rome in September 1986 and spent a month in the beautiful light of early autumn before going to Athens and then crossing over to Spetsis by boat from Piraeus. I wanted to spend a few months in Greece before settling down in Italy. By mid-October, the Greek tourist season was over, and the exhausted Greeks had started to close up their hotels, restaurants, and souvenir shops. Around this time of year, it's cold despite the fact that it's Greece, and the weather gradually gets worse. Cloudy days grew in number, cold winds blew in, and it started to rain often. Anyone who's taken a cruise ship through the islands of the sunny Aegean Sea of summer would be surprised to know how quiet, and at times even melancholy, a place it can become once autumn sets in. Why did we, my wife and I, choose such a difficult to appreciate season to live on a Greek island? First, the cost of living was cheap. At the time, we didn't have the economic leeway to live for several months on a Greek island during the high season with its expensive prices and rents. Also, the off-season and its bad weather was quiet and suited for getting work done. Greece in summer can be too rowdy. I'd gotten tired of working in Japan. There were a lot of reasons for this, and I can't explain them in a single phrase. And I wanted to go to a foreign country to escape the bothersome everyday and focus quietly on work. If possible, I wanted to settle down and write a long novel. So I left Japan and decided to live in Europe for a little while. And we know now that that novel was Norwegian Wood, and that's where Murakami's head was as he left on his trip. This brings us to our final year. In 1987, Murakami writes 2 essay collections, 3 translations, and 1 novel. The first essay collection is called The Scrap, The Nostalgic 1980s. It's published in February 1st of 1987, and these are columns that were serialized from April 20th, 1984 to February 25th, 1986 in Sports Graphic Number under the title Scrap, or maybe you translate that into English as The Scrap or My Scrap or something like that. This is sort of like a magazine like Japanese Sports Illustrated, but it seems like it's similar to his other nonfiction writing. I haven't read it myself, but Japanese Wikipedia summarizes a few of the essays. He writes about Karen Carpenter's death and how it affected him. He writes about the film Sophie's Choice, and he writes about wakame salad is what he eats for breakfast during the summer. Again, this is Murakami being extremely prolific. He's writing these from 84 to 86 while he's writing everything else that he's written during that period, including Hardball Wonderland and Into the World and tons of other short stories. On April 1st, 1987, Murakami publishes a set of essays called Factories in the Land of the Rising Sun. The Japanese title is Hizuru Kuni no Kojo. This is a set of 7 kakioroshi essays, so they weren't serialized, about factories in Japan. This is a really interesting collection. It's one that he researched from January to August 1986 with Anzai Mizumaru. They visited, I guess, 7 different companies. Kyoto Kagaku is one that makes medical teaching materials. He visited a wedding venue. He visited a eraser company, a dairy farm, the Comme des Garçons fashion label, Technics, a CD factory, and a wig manufacturer called Adirans. And this is his first kakioroshi essays collection. It has excellent illustrations by Anzai Mizumaru. It's got a nice introduction where Murakami mentions how factory visits was something he always enjoyed when he was in school. And it has an afterword by Anzai Mizumaru, who mentions the Elephant Factory's Happy End, the earlier book that they did, and how much fun they had on that, which I think kind of suggests maybe that there's a kind of unspoken connection between those 2 works. I would really like to see something like this in translation. I haven't read it, but it feels really well put together, beautifully illustrated, and I think it would be awesome to see how critics would react to this side of Murakami. It also has a nice little connection with the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. In that book, he does part-time work for a wig manufacturer, kind of surveying people's bald heads. And that seems to be inspired from this visit to this wig factory. On July 25th, 1987, Murakami publishes a translation of World's End and Other Stories, a collection of short stories by Paul Theroux. This is one that he just kind of happened to read. He says he doesn't mention where he came across it. And he mentions that he came to know Thoreau pretty well, and he has meals with him sometimes. These stories were all published in magazines like Bungakukai, Tokyojin, Marie Claire, Japan, all through 1986. And on September 10th, 1987, Murakami publishes Norwegian Wood. This is the book that changes his career as a writer. It's instantly a bestseller. It goes on to sell over 1 million copies and basically enables him, I think, to do whatever he wants with the rest of his life. So I'm sure a lot of you know the story, but just to give a quick summary, the story is about Toru Watanabe. He's the narrator. He's telling this story at 37 years old, looking back on his college experience. He addresses the politics of the era, his grief for the suicide of his best friend Kizuki, and his unrequited love for Naoko, Kizuki's girlfriend. Toru is so consumed by his feelings that he's unable to give attention to those who are trying to connect with him, namely Midori, a classmate. Toru gets an up-close view of Japan's elite in his dorm mate Nagasawa and of student radicals, and he doesn't seem to be impressed by either. The experience leaves Toru feeling kind of broken and unable to connect. Key points about Norwegian Wood. It's straight realism. This is the first novel written kind of in that style. It's building on Firefly, which is a technique he used in Hardball Wonderland, the novel immediately preceding this. Has long chapters, lots of dialogue. As I mentioned in the last podcast, he set out a goal of writing scenes with 3 people talking in this book. It has an afterword, like Dance, Dance, Dance. It has an afterwards. It dedicates the book to his friends in college and mentions expanding Firefly and initially wanting to write a 300 manuscript page book that then blew up into 900 pages. The afterword also mentions that he wrote it in 4 months, that he started it on December 21st, 1986 in Mykonos, Greece, and he finished it on March 27th, 1987 in an apartment in Rome. And unlike his origin story with the Yakult Swallows, he's been incredibly consistent with this story. In his book Toi Taiko, Distant Drums, which I just quoted from, about the trip, he basically writes through the experience of writing Norwegian Wood. And he kept really detailed diaries of this trip and basically wrote an essay collection about the experience that was published in 1990 after that. And so I'll read a few passages that I've translated from that. So their first stop is Mykonos in Greece, and the weather is pretty terrible, and this is what Murakami has to say. But as a result, despite this terrible weather, or perhaps precisely because of this terrible weather, Mykonos during the off-season was actually the ideal environment for me to quietly get some work done. Here I completed the translation of C.D.B. Bryan's novel, The Great Death Reef. It was pretty long, but the story was interesting, and I wanted to get through it quickly and start working on my own novel, so I steadily worked through the translation every day. I still wasn't using a word processor at this point, so I crammed my writing into a college notebook with a fountain pen. Once I made it to the end of The Great Death Reef, I wrote several sketch-like pieces of writing about life on Spetses, the basis for the essays in this book, and then got started on the long-awaited novel. During that time, my body had this incredible itch to write a novel. I was parched, thirsting for words. Bringing myself to that point was the most important thing. You can't write a long novel without bringing yourself right up to a point like that. Just like running a marathon, if you fail to make the adjustments to get to that point, you won't have the breath for the long haul. That novel would later become Norwegian Wood, but I didn't have a title at that point. I started writing casually with the goal of making it a smooth 300 to 350 pages or so of 400 character manuscript paper. But when I'd written 600 pages, I realized that's not going to work. There's no way I'll finish in 300 to 400 pages. From that point until April of the following year, 1987, I became completely absorbed in novel life as we moved between Sicily and Rome. In the end, the completed novel was 900 pages. So as they traveled, Murakami was literally carrying around hundreds of pages of handwritten paper with this novel on it. And to give you an idea of that, here's a passage from the day that they leave Mykonos. December 28th, 1986, Sunday, rain. I'm leaving this island today. I woke up at 6:30, sat at my desk, and worked on the novel for an hour, and then put the bundle of papers into a large envelope when I made it to a temporary stopping place. Then I placed this securely at the bottom of my suitcase so it wouldn't get folded. Today is also the end of my stay on Mykonos. However, now that I think about the month and a half I've lived here, the weather has been awful the entire time. Once or twice a week, we'd get perfectly clear days, but other than that, it was terrible. It rained or it was windy, or it was rainy and windy, and most days the sky was gloomily overcast. We were surrounded by beautiful coastline, but I was only able to get in the water and go swimming once. In the end, our final day here is raining as well, a silent misty rain. The wind is also blowing. Murakami goes on to mention the sheep that kind of surround the house that they're renting there, which he goes back and visits in his 2011 essay. And then he has a really nice passage about the rain. When I write on a rainy morning, somehow it ends up being writing that feels like a raining morning. No matter how much work I put into it later on, I can never get the scent of that morning rain out of it. The scent of the rain falling silently on the lonely pasture from which each and every sheep has disappeared. The scent of the rain that covered that old truck crossing the mountains. My writing is redolent with that morning rain, partly out of fate. So at the end of 1986, the Murakami's head from Mykonos to Athens and then to Rome, where they spend New Year's. Then they head to Sicily for a month, which left a really negative impression on Murakami. He says that they would have left if they hadn't already paid the rent and didn't have a commitment to do a piece of writing for an in-flight magazine there. The city's dirty and run down. There's a lot of crime and it's noisy. Here's what he says about writing in Palermo. I lived in that city for a month, and the whole time I was writing Norwegian Wood. I wrote about a sixth of the way through that novel here. Unlike Mykonos, I wasn't able to go out for walks even when the sun was out, which I guess was tough. If I suddenly wanted a quick change of scenery, I couldn't just take one. So we twice left Palermo to go on short trips. We went once to Taormina and once to Malta. Then we returned to Palermo, where I confined myself to the room and worked. It was hard to keep writing the novel every day. There were times it even felt like I was grinding down my bones or consuming my own flesh. You might say that it wasn't that massive a novel, but to the writer, that was what it felt like. However, it was more painful not to write. Writing is hard, but writing itself wants to be written. The most important thing when this happens is focus. The focus to throw yourself into that world, and the strength to sustain that focus for as long as possible. If you do this, you'll find that at some point you conquer the pain, and you have to believe in yourself. Believe that you have the strength within yourself to complete it. From there, the Murakami's head to Rome, and they're staying in a old hotel called Villa Tre Colli, which is kind of on the edge of the city. And here's what he says about finishing up the first draft. I finished the first draft of the novel on March 7th. March 7th was a frigid Saturday. Romans call March a crazy month. The changes in weather and temperature are random and sudden. The day before can be a pleasantly warm spring day, yet overnight it will be back to midwinter. That day I woke up at 5:30, did a quick run in the garden, and then wrote for 17 hours without a break. I finished the novel just before midnight. Judging from my diary, I was predictably exhausted. I wrote just a single sentence. It went really well. I called Kinoshita Yoko with Kodansha's publishing division to tell her I'd basically finished the novel, and she said there was a trade fair for picture books in Bologna at the beginning of April that someone from Kodansha's international team would be attending, and asked whether I might be able to hand over the manuscript directly to them at the fair. I think the book's pretty good, I said, and she said, oh yeah? It's 900 pages? Are you sure it's that good? With some doubt in her voice. She's a bit of a skeptic. So here we have the return of Kinoshita Yoko, or Saito Yoko. So I guess she really kind of bookends the early part of Murakami's career. She's involved with Hear the Wind Sing, and now has a kind of random hand in Norwegian Wood. And this trade fair in Bologna is not just any old trade fair. This is the children's book fair in Bologna. That is probably, I think, the most famous children's book trade fair in the world. So it's incredible that they're kind of passing the literal football at this trade fair, 900 pages of handwritten manuscript that Murakami has written here in Europe. But first he has to do an edit. Later in that same chapter, he mentions the second drafts. Here's what he has to say about that. The next day, I started on the second draft right away. I took the draft that I'd written in notebooks and on letter paper and rewrote it completely from the beginning. I don't mean to brag, but completely rewriting a draft of 900, 400-character pages with a ballpoint pen isn't the type of work you can do without endurance. I finished the second draft on March 26th. I was really hurrying because I had to finish before the book fair in Bologna, so by the end, my right arm was so tired I could barely move it. Thankfully, I don't usually get tight shoulders, so my shoulders were fine, but my arm was shot. So when I had any downtime, I was careful to do push-ups on the floor. Writing a full-length novel is far more labor-intensive than most people might think. Thanks to the introduction of the word processor, it's gotten a lot easier these days. And I'll just share one last super quick quote. This is the next chapter where he doesn't really mention too much about the novel, except for this. After I handed over the manuscript for Norwegian Wood in Bologna, I decided to take it easy and rest my mind and body. It feels incredible. It feels like I completely unloaded everything I was carrying around with me. And that's it. That's Norwegian Wood. I'll put links to all the blog posts where I analyze those passages in the blog post for this podcast episode. There are a lot of others too. He's working so hard on Norwegian Wood that he's having nightmares about dying young, like F. Scott Fitzgerald during the writing of The Last Tycoon. But fortunately for Murakami, he makes it through. Speaking of S. Scott Fitzgerald, there is a connection to Murakami's next work. On November 1st, 1987, he publishes his translation of The Great Death Reef by C.D.B. Bryant. This is the book that he mentioned in his memoir, Distant Drums, that he finished the translation for that before he finished Norwegian Wood. And it's not a good novel. I bought a copy of it and kind of speed read through it a couple of years ago, and it's not great. And Murakami even recognizes this in his book about his translation. He says that it's not widely read, but he claims to still enjoy it, and he considers it a work of city fiction, which the way Murakami describes it is kind of in opposition to Junbungaku, pure literature. Murakami reads it as an homage to Gatsby, which is really the only thing it has going for it. Even C.D.B. Bryant didn't like it. I was able to dig up a website that his children write, a blog that one of his children has been writing with anecdotes from his letters that include this line. So I went back to read Death Reef yesterday and hated every minute of it. Why is it so difficult to reread something after it has been published? So yeah, to be an absolute completionist, I tracked it down on Amazon, read a few chapters, and then felt like that was about all I could take. It is, I guess, prescient in the sense of how far the Gatsby revival would take F. Scott Fitzgerald's stock, and it reads like a bit of a pastiche of Gatsby had Gatsby actually married Daisy and then realized that wanting someone is better than actually getting someone that you really love, that you're obsessed with, I should say. So that's the second to last translation that Murakami does in 1987. The last one is published on December 1st, 1987, and it's The Polar Express by Chris Van Allsburg. He finishes the year with another Van Allsburg translation, probably one of his most well-known, probably the most well-known, I would say. And again, this won the Caldecott in 85. So Murakami's kind of keeping pace with Allsburg. And that completes the first 8 years of Murakami's bibliography. I think the key takeaways are that Murakami really seems to get a running start. He's writing fiction, of course, but he's also serializing essays, finding publications to experiment with short fiction, putting out collected short fiction. He's collaborating with illustrators and other writers. He's part of the conversation in Japan of the 1980s, even if he's not embraced by the literary establishment. This shows Murakami developing his voice, coming to terms with the late 60s through his writing, and having fun observing all aspects of the world around him through cultural criticism and art. I think it also shows what a behemoth the publishing industry is in Japan. And I think the publishing industry of the current day is more similar to that moment than it is different, to be honest. I think you see this reflected in how much material gets published in present-day Japan. If you sat through the entire podcast, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Please send me any questions or comments. You can reach me at howtojapanese@gmail.com. I think this will probably be the most granular of the 3 episodes that I do about the bibliography, because I know the most about this period of Murakami's career, and also because I know I just don't have the time to do 6 hours of recording for the rest of his career. I'll have myself on a much tighter leash for the next 2 episodes. I hope that you'll tune in then.